Hello, my name is Scott Pace, and I'm a professor at George Washington University, where I direct the Space Policy Institute. Today, I'd like to talk about international space law, policy, and the solar system internet. This is for the Space Summit 2025 as part of the Interplanetary Network, a special interest group. The solar system internet, I think as many of you know, is an idea that it's been emerging over some decades now, but is starting to pick up speed as human exploration starts expanding further out into the solar system, and as the pace of robotic space exploration picks up. The old systems of direct duplex communications are still, of course, in use today, but I think people are seeing that this needs to be a new, maybe more networked form, given the kinds of experiences we've had with the internet on Earth. However, a solar system internet is quite a bit different than a terrestrial internet would be, and it's likely to go through some of the similar phases. Today, space communications is driven by government and space agency backbone networks, with government agencies cooperating together with support from commercial providers. As we look toward the second phase of where the solar system internet might be going, we would have government space agency backbone networks, but increasingly commercial backbone networks. NASA, for example, has been making efforts to transition to greater reliance on buying support services, communication services, from the private sector rather than owning and operating all of its own network. Of course, it's pioneered that in launch, is quite famous with the Commercial Crew and commercial cargo programs, but it's also been taking place in space communications as well, as the United States transitions away from a traditional TDRS network to a one that is a more commercially based system. In the farther term, looking at, say, phase 3, maybe several decades from now, yes, we'll still have government and space agency backbone networks, but we'll have commercial backbone networks. But even academic institutions may have their own systems. One can imagine universities, nonprofits, private sector, other kinds of activities operating their own networks independently. Now, the trick in all this is to make sure these systems can talk with each other. One of the dangers of a solar system internet, as in the case of the terrestrial internet, is the growth of proprietary systems, leading to what might call a balkanized network, which have great difficulty talking to each other. Of course, protocols can be written for interoperability between networks, but it's certainly much harder if you don't plan for it in the beginning. And so a lot of what we talk about in governance is about ensuring this kind of openness, interoperability, and if I may say, multi-stakeholder engagement in governance of the system, as opposed to simply being whatever it is a particular government agency or a particular company wants to provide. The interplanetary internet will be very familiar in many ways, but it's going to be different. If a simple way to think about it is that the terrestrial internet is kind of like traveling from Los Angeles to San Diego. You get on the freeway, you drive where the signs point you, and you get to your destination. So this is an example of where a government program that transitioned to a multi-stakeholder enterprise over time. Technology came first, and governance came later. Some ways that was good. In some ways, it caused problems that we're still working out. An interplanetary internet is a bit different. It's more like traveling from Los Angeles to Jakarta. That is, you have to go to the airport, you get on an airplane, the airplane makes a long flight, makes a stop, you change planes, you get onto another plane, makes a long flight, makes a stop, maybe even more than one, in order to get to your final destination. It's not a matter of simply proceeding directly to your destination, but going where you can go and then picking up transition points. If you can think about this, of course, it makes sense from interplanetary because planets move. They turn. Time and opportunity for communications come up and then they go. And so putting together a contact plan that enables you to go to your final destination is much more complex than on the terrestrial internet. Space communications today are mostly point-to-point, and they're governed by National Space Agency and cooperative agreements among those agencies. Barriers to entry on the interplanetary internet are certainly going to be higher, but there's opportunities to take lessons learned from the terrestrial internet experience. My colleague, Laura Donardis at Georgetown University, specializes in the history of the internet, and she's done some great work thinking about governance of the solar system internet going into the future. And she's published some insights on space governance derived from her experience and observation of terrestrial internet governance. By the way, she also has her own presentation, part of this webinar series, and I urge you to take a look at it. It covers a lot of more specific space issues, things like orbital debris and more international space law in some depth. So again, I commend her presentation to you. This is a chart from one of her presentations where she talks about a number of insights that she believes are important for a solar system internet. Things like a common numbering system, certainly concerns over conflicts, over control of addressing. She believes that the solar system internet should interoperate with the classical internet. And to avoid fragmentation, that balkanization I mentioned requires harmonization of standards. Open standards are necessary now if you're going to encourage private investment later. If you have a fully proprietary system, it's going to be difficult to get the kind of scale needed, I think, to trigger higher private investment as the system expands. Now, having agreement on standardization doesn't assure implementation or usage. We're all familiar with standards that people don't really use. And of course, standardization can become highly politicized. Certainly the kinds of debates over standards we've seen in telecom can certainly happen in the space regime as well. Infrastructure, whoever owns it and operates it, could certainly be co-opted as a proxy for political power. And there'll be tensions between multilateral needs of states and the multi-stakeholder models where we try to provide more room for civil society, for academic users, NGOs, companies, and just citizens who are interested in having their needs met, as opposed to simply the primacy of needs of states. Network security is going to both support and pose challenges to national security, and cybersecurity will become a really great human rights issue, and I would say probably has already become a great human rights issue. Now, I put two red arrows on this to really highlight two items that I'd like to highlight or comment on. First of all, the common numbering system certainly is necessary to understand it, but the real issue here is what is necessary for interoperability. One could imagine the need to have disjoint systems between, say, planetary surfaces and operations in free space. That is, you don't want the Wi-Fi network on your lunar base to get confused with a message which is transiting, say, from the moon to Mars, or networks aboard a space station to get confused with a terrestrial network. So a common understanding of numbering is certainly necessary, but whether everything has to have the same numbering system can still be debated. The question is what is it that provides interoperability? A second point here is a solar system internet should interoperate with the classical internet. Again, I think there's some debate on this point. I recall experiences in standards bodies where there were proposals to have direct access to space assets from the regular internet. And many of the technical people in that meeting were quite uncomfortable because of security issues. So the degree to which being able to pass messages back and forth was recognized, but interoperation was had several layers of discussion to it. And there were certainly cyber risks for direct access, as well as issues of disjointing the numbering system in one place in order to not confuse it with another operation. So there's a number of layers of discussion that happen under each of these points. Also, taking from Professor Donardis's work, she talks about a framework for multi-stakeholder internet governance, something which I strongly support, and the needs for how to administer critical internet resources, setting of standards, governance, interconnection agreements, policy roles of how private intermediaries are used, and then what government regulations and policies are. Again, probably of no surprise to people watching this, is that states sometimes have different interests than those of their citizens or of the other stakeholders who wind up using the internet. And there has certainly been international debates and pressures for states to exercise more direct control over the internet. And one can think of examples of not just for cybersecurity and preventing criminal activities, but also for political purposes, suppression of speech, human rights abuses, and so forth. So that a multi-stakeholder approach, which seems the most safest and probably the most correct, does run into opposition when states have different interests. Now, points out a couple of differences with internet governance here. The client server and architecture is certainly different. It's upended, as is put here, by the unique conditions in space. That is, you don't have a direct connection from Los Angeles to San Diego, but you have to wait for your time. You have to wait for the planets to line up. You have to handle large delays, time delays, of course, as being one of the most major differences in transmitting over interplanetary distances as opposed to terrestrial differences. There are differences in the way nodes are numbered. There's a thing called bundle protocol, which again, many of you are probably familiar with, and how those nodes are handled. There's a mention here that IANA and SANA, both space numbering assignment entities, are entering this space, if you will, but should emphasize that IANA is really the de jure authority, that SANA certainly plays a large role, and therefore people maybe are more familiar with it. But IANA is the ultimate de jure authority on this. So it's not a matter of shared governance between these two organizations. As I mentioned, there are long time delays in getting communications across. And so having a delay tolerant network or disruption tolerant network standards is critically important. This is, again, a subject of some technical debate. But the standard TCP IP protocols that we're familiar with certainly don't work in the same way in space and over long time delays as they work here on Earth. This in turn means things like bundled protocols rather than standard internet protocols are necessary to handle the kinds of connections and delays that interplanetary distances create. Private companies are not yet in the lead, unlike the case with early ARPANET innovation environment. So it requires maybe some incentive and structure and certainly open protocols for engaging those companies. If not, the danger, of course, is that government agencies will continue to drive, which can lead to multilateral emphasis as opposed to multi-stakeholder. And if private companies respond to, say, particular space agency needs, there is a danger of having specialized and proprietary protocols that makes it more difficult for later entrants to come in. So open networks don't happen just naturally. They really have to be nurtured and ensured. Interconnection certainly is going to be initially public, not private. And there's a need for some greater transparency via contact plans and how they're provided. Again, because you can imagine multiple messages wanting to go, say, to the moon or to Mars or to space stations. And having some transparency into how those contact plans are done to deal with limited infrastructure resources for transmission and reception is going to be important. Government cooperation is far more important, but jurisdiction and sovereignty, of course, are still disputed. Those things have taken many years to settle somewhat tentatively in the case of the internet, and they're certainly not fully settled in space. Now, a couple of protocol issues I should bring to your attention. IP addresses on other planets and in space. Probably one of the most serious issues is really a lack of clear requirements. Many people on projects and programs that are under budget and time pressures rightly seek to take the simplest and most direct path to accomplishing their missions. And they still use IP. There needs to be a transition strategy to implement delay tolerant networking, bundled protocols. I've run into cases where systems are still using IP version 4, much less IP version 6. So thinking ahead in the architecture to what it ought to be, and then making sure those goal requirements are built into nearer term missions. And of course, there's going to be a tension there because missions that are, again, under time and budget pressure are going to be loath to take on requirements that they don't absolutely positively have to have them. It's likely that independent internets, emphasis on the plural, And using IP will arise on other planets. One can imagine a Wi-Fi network on the moon, or a network connecting rovers and other machines operating in close proximity to each other for navigating the solar system. Recommendations are needed now on how to disjunct Earth uses of the IP address space from users off of Earth, how to allocate off-Earth IP numbering resources from dedicated blocks, so a Mars block, a Moon block, an Earth orbiting space station block, and so on. And the same arguably should be done for autonomous system network, autonomous system numbering space. There are workable solutions to ensure necessary uniqueness, but again, attention needs to be paid. Now, there are some recommendations needed for node numbers and names, a numbering and domain name structure that enables future expansion and scaling of the interplanetary internet, how authorities and sub-authorities for numbering are to be managed, that is, at the national level, at an agency level, a program level, a project level. That is, how are these numbering schemes to be delegated, and how are any potential conflicts over resources to be resolved? Whether or not there needs to be a defined relationship between IP addresses, node numbers, domain names. Domain names are critical components of course, internet, electronic mail, and the World Wide Web. It's an open question whether domain names should be created for use with the bundle protocol, and how such references between the internets, and interplanetary internet should work. So again, it's very natural to think of domain name for the moon or Mars or asteroids and so forth. But really nailing that down and getting some consensus agreement that people can architect to is still a need. So, of course, in all this discussion of standards, what about the international standards organizations? After naming and numbering protocols and spectrum allocation, decisions are needed on some key standards. As I mentioned, definition of domain name boundaries between Earth and non-Earth domains. Certainly, physical characteristics are plausible, such as the gravitational sphere of influence or transmission distance, or alternatively, topological connectivity, sharing of a common contact graph, may be more pragmatic. It's perhaps, again, no surprise that there is not a really hard and fast definition of even what cislunar space means. Does that mean within a certain so many kilometer radius of the moon? Does it mean within gravitational sphere of influence? Could it be set by time delays, however many microseconds, for transmission? So actually, where Earth begins and ends, and where space begins and ends, where the moon begins and ends, these things are all subject to being more precisely defined. And you can imagine the need for it as you transition from communicating in one domain to another. When you're on the Earth, when you're on a space station, when you're in transit to the moon, when you're on the moon, and passing between different regimes. How will those numbering schemes change? How will the standards and protocols change? It's not likely to be as seamless as going to a new Wi-Fi network, but we can certainly hope. An underlying requirement is, of course, the adoption of coordinate systems for operations across these physical domains. I think in particular, a barycentric celestial reference frame, relative to the center of mass, is likely the most useful. But again, these coordinate systems still need to be nailed down. They are well used within existing scientific systems, but still wait to be fully adopted, I think, formally in a solar system internet context. There are requirements for time standards and distribution of precision time for efficient functioning of the network. I think we're all used to that in terms of time protocols for terrestrial internet, network time protocol. But time on the moon is different. It's a different gravitational field. It's moving. So general and special relativistic effects have to be taken into account. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Time transfer is largely a solved problem for Earth-based networks. But for the interplanetary internet, the problem of determining what time it is at each node is complicated by large distances, and again, these relativistic effects I mentioned. The next level problem is correcting for computer and spacecraft clock drifts. Time synchronization from Earth may be sufficient, or local time references on the moon or Mars could be used, that is, say, a network of local atomic clocks. For the internet, there is a network time protocol for clock synchronization to coordinated universal time, or UTC. Should there be a space NTP? Now, a cost risk trade for implementing a space NTP, I'm sorry, is whether a single clock on the moon or Mars would suffer gravitational effects and create a single systemic bias. On Earth, we have multiple atomic clocks around the world that are used to develop UTC. So how we should develop, say, a lunar time standard if that's needed is, again, a subject for discussion. This raises a potential policy issue as well, not just a technical one, in that all official UTC sites are defined as terrestrial laboratories. That is, using a terrestrial UTC may be acceptable, say, out to geosynchronous orbit, but beyond geo, it may be desirable to create a separate UTC moon or a UTC Mars that would be recognized by the global timing community. And ideally, local NTP would be available in each world. But again, today, if we're talking about, say, GPS time, we talked about it being steered toward UTC USNO, US Naval Observatory. We'll talk about UTC time in Paris, Tokyo, Moscow, Beijing. These are all terrestrial laboratories. There is not a space laboratory, if you will, site that's recognized. So if you were to have UTC Moon or UTC Mars, there's going to have to be a discussion about how they fit into the international time community. I mentioned briefly spectrum earlier. Of course, one of the foundational requirements, it's often said that the only thing you need for a space mission is gravity and radio frequencies. Well, we've got gravity, but radio frequencies sometimes are harder. At the last World Radio Conference of the International Telecom Union in 2023, there was a conclusion for a future agenda item to consider studies on spectrum needs and regulatory measures for possible new allocations and identifications with needed for regulatory provisions. I'm sorry, lots of footnotes here, to support communication systems on the lunar surface or in lunar orbit. And there's a series of frequency bands defined here. So lunar communications and navigation are looking to get their own identified frequencies to which various systems may then apply. The ITU allocates services, so they're not allocating frequencies for specific systems. That is done by national authorities. So if a United States or China has a lunar communication networks, their national authorities will provide the authorization for using those particular frequencies. But the service and what bands they're going to be on, the allocations, if you will, are agreed to on an international basis. And that's what's going to be a topic of discussion and hopefully confirmation at the next World Radio Conference in 2027. And studies are being led now. There's a working party, 7B, that has also been meeting. So building the foundations for the comm network and navigation network that hopefully the future solar system internet will also rely on. I mentioned time earlier. The Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House developed a workshop and memorandum and position on coordinated lunar time to establish cislunar operations and maintain traceability to UTC. Notice it doesn't say it is a kind of UTC, it says traceability to a UTC. And NASA is tasked with other departments to support the gradual establishment of lunar infrastructure, again, based upon coordinated lunar time. And so this is ongoing discussion. And really what's rather striking about this is this was done at the level of the White House. It was done at the level of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which recognized the importance of precision time to humans and robotic space exploration and to building of infrastructure across the solar system. Now, for the international community, we have the Artemis Accords. Now, this is different than the Artemis program, which is a specific NASA-led effort for returning humans to the moon and further exploration of moon and Mars. But as part or as in parallel with it, there are the Artemis Accords, which are more of a political statement. The Accords represent existing international law and policy, but in specific application to the moon. That is, what common set of values and principles will states cooperating in the Artemis program accede to? That is, what are their shared common values? As of May 2025, there are 55 signatories, which is rather impressive. And Section 5 of the Artemis Accords calls for interoperability across all partners. Doesn't mean everybody has the same thing, doesn't mean people operate in the same way, but it does call for interoperability between different national systems and presumably different commercial and private systems under the jurisdiction or control of member states who have signed on to the Artemis Accords. So here you see language where it says the signatories commit to use reasonable efforts to utilize current interoperability standards for space-based infrastructure and to establish such standards, that is, new standards, when current standards do not exist or are inadequate. And one can certainly imagine that applying to a solar system internet. As I mentioned earlier, there is not a one set of definitions for even what constitutes cislunar space. There is a thing called the Global Navigation Satellite Services Space Service Volume, which specifies power levels and requirements for GPS-based services, which can extend out to the moon, as recently demonstrated, just last several months. But that's really not tied to the cislunar term. The relationship between interplanetary internet domains and physical domains is a likely topic for discussion among Artemis Accord signatories. There is an existing system under development, LunaNet, by Japan, Europe, and the United States, that could be the basis for this, and getting a common understanding across the principles for Artemis Accord signatories could then help set standards for what will be physical and technical standards in LunaNet and subsequent systems. Platforms in near-Earth orbit, for example, may be part of an Earth domain, while lunar gateway or surface operations would be part of the moon domain. Subregions of the moon could include shadowed craters and underground tunnels, not directly accessible to communications from Earth. So you can imagine pseudolights, relay systems, and so forth for operating in these somewhat challenged or denied areas. The international governance of cislunar PNT is laying some interesting precedents. We're seeing that current international law, of course, and IT regulations apply, and that cislunar PNT, position, navigation, timing, is part of space-to-space radio navigation satellite services operating in what's called NGSO, that is non-geostationary orbit, so basically everything except geostationary orbit. And these discussions are going on today. There are intergovernmental agreements for the ISS, the International Space Station, which includes the Lunar Gateway, but they don't extend to the lunar surface. China's work on International Lunar Research Station has mechanisms that are still in work, discussing among their partner countries. And given the increasing complexity of space operations at the moon, I believe, certainly, and I think others do, that a new mechanism is needed to ensure safe and responsible operations. That is, this needs to be at least multilateral, not just bilateral or regional, say among Artemis Accord signatories, but needs to be broader and more inclusive. And it probably needs to be at the level of sovereign states, which are still responsible for the activities of entities subject to their jurisdiction or control. That is, private entity, which is subject to national law and regulation, is then the responsibility of that member state. The United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space approved a draft mandate for an action team on lunar activities consultation in June of last year. The UN COPUS Committee will be meeting again in June of this year, 2025. And it's modeled on the longstanding International Committee on GNSS, which has been, I think, quite successful in coordinating and sharing technical information among GNSS system providers, such as GPS, Beidou, Galileo, GLONASS, and so forth. It reports to its parent body, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and then goes up bureaucratically to the UN Fourth Committee in New York. This is a totally non-binding process. It doesn't have binding authority. It doesn't have legally binding authorities, but it's focused on improving technical transparency and information exchange among the member states who will be operating in and around the moon. There are many potential topics beyond just cislunar PNT, lunar space situational awareness, so we can avoid collisions and debris, safety frequencies, sizes of landing zones, debris mitigation, and so on, in some detail that will be needed to be discussed between entities operating in and around the moon. And so, again, we've set a precedent with GNSS systems, and we're going to try to see if that can be extended to more complex operations. So where are we going? Decisions on cislunar PNT, I would argue, are creating a technical foundation and a policy foundation for the governance issues that can enable a solar system internet. RF spectrum allocations, expansion of optical communication technology are happening now. Lunar and solar system time and geodetic standards are in development now. Expanding delay tolerant network and bundled protocol use, and having at least more than one lunar navigation service provider is something everyone, I think, sees as desirable, but of course it's always slower than one wants. Multi-stakeholder engagement, engagement by industry and academia on their internet experiences is becoming more important. And again, as I mentioned, Professor Gennardis pointed out a number of lessons learned from the internet to date. And these new technical groups may emerge as they did with the terrestrial internet. So the Interplanetary Network Special Interest Group that we're part of today under the Internet Society is one example. Questions such as lunar PNT frame identifications and subframe networking, how that will work with lunar communications, IP addresses, ASN deconfliction, off-Earth node numbers and names. These are all things that are still somewhat TBD, and they need to be nailed down a bit more solidly in order to provide confidence to people actually building equipment and operating missions in the relatively near future. There is a number of forums for multilateral coordination of lunar operations. The Artemis Accords and the International Lunar Research Station program all have various principles that you can point to. Perhaps in the future, there'll be a cross-recognition agreement between the Artemis Accord signatories and the Chinese-led ILRS. But for right now, there doesn't appear to be a major source of conflict, but we're not really formally on the same page. The other acronyms on the bottom, things like the Space Frequency Coordination Group, Consultative Committee on Space Data Standards, International Advisory Committee on Interoperability, so on and so forth. As I mentioned, the UN Advisory Action Team on Lunar Activities Consultation, the International Commission on Committee on GNSS, and so on. So there are plenty of places where this can go, and it does take some effort to kind of keep up with the confusion and the overlapping names. There's only a small number of people who really do understand all these things, and yet there are a number of forums where greater understanding is still needed. Some observations to close with. There's no fundamental governance barriers, to the creation of the interplanetary internet, that the multiple forums exist and to explain and promote the concept. There's no centralized authority that can really say no, but there are a set of technical standards, interfaces, and protocols that must be tended and implemented. Consultative Committee on Space Data Standards is working on several standards relative to interplanetary internet, and that work can certainly overlap with other standards bodies such as the IETF, IOEG, ITU, T-Sector, and so on. So again, tracking all these things is itself a bit of a job. The interplanetary network, in my opinion, cannot be based solely on IP, but needs to use DTN, bundled protocol networks, and we can debate the details of which ones. But again, the long time distances and the nature of the space environment, I think, argue fairly strongly against simply trying to adapt or modify pure IP. Now, that said, IP may be used in very localized systems, and determining time to include relativistic corrections may be a pacing challenge. How good the NTP server is and what range it's good to can be a technical question. So spectrum for lunar communications needs to be recognized internationally. We're hoping that will happen at Work 27. The United States has proposed a specific agenda item. It doesn't look to be a major conflict with anyone else, including China, but there are always details that have to be worked out and assurances provided on anytime you expand spectrum allocations to a new regime. If you want to read more about these kinds of subjects, I refer you to the IPNSIG report on solar system internet architecture and governance, where we tried to cover these issues in more detail, and the QR code is there on your screen. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any discussion.